A common axiom is that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Another axiom is that we sweat in peace so that we don't bleed in war. Here at the Marine Corps Association, we fully understand both. That is why we offer through our professional development page on our website a comprehensive catalog of battle studies, tactical and ethical decision games, and war games to ensure that not only do we learn from the past, but we embrace the thoughts and decisions that influence the outcomes of some of the greatest actions of the Marine Corps. We have tools and techniques that will enhance both unit training as well as enable comprehensive self-study. Check out all that the Marine Corps Association has to offer on our website. Go to mca-marines.org/professional-development. That's mca-marines.org/professional-development and get your reps and sets in. Hey, Scuttlebutt listeners. Welcome to episode 226. If you're like me, the news cycle churns at a dizzying pace, and events come and go off the radar like submarines in the hunt for Red October. To that, the situation in Venezuela is still very fluid and fraught with hazards. Carrier groups remain in the Caribbean, and there are clearly forces still operating in the Pacific near Central and South America. To help us digest all that has transpired in Venezuela and understand the implications, Ben Connable was kind enough to come down and help us conclude our discussion of Operation Absolute Resolve, the military operation in Venezuela to capture President Nicolas Maduro. Ben was recently in on episode 219 to talk us through the cautionary tale of military intervention in Venezuela, so it only made sense to have him come on and give us his thoughts on the raid and to speculate what's next. We also talked through how operational and tactical success doesn't guarantee strategic victory, and what a foreign policy that embraces spheres of influence means to the global community. We made this caveat during our conversation, but it is important to continue to emphasize that none of us are experts on Venezuela, and so we discuss our ideas and theories based on the open source, unclassified information available at the time, which oftentimes leads to speculation. This is episode 226. Hey, Scuttlebutt listeners, thank you for joining us and your continued support. I'm Vic. I'm here with William.
Howdy, y'all.
And we're so really happy to have Ben Connable back on the show. So, Ben, thank you so much for coming back.
Always happy to be here.
So, for those who are paying attention to our robust and excellent catalog, you'll know that Ben actually was just on the show maybe a month ago. And at that time, we were doing a lot of strategic posturing. We were moving strategic assets into the Caribbean. And we were Ben helped us present a realistic, somewhat of a cautionary tale about military intervention in Venezuela, what that meant, what the role of the Marine Corps would be, what that meant towards our national defense strategy, our national security strategy, what the end game is there. It's wonderful, wonderful episode. Please go back and check it out. But so we thought now with Operation Absolute Resolve, very distant within, a distant memory within the current news cycle, but not so much for people who are still kind of digesting what that operation was, what it did, where are we at, where are we going with it. And so we thought it would be very valuable to have Ben back on the show because you were just on talking about what some of the effects might be. And then here we are, if what I could tell was not something that we had discussed, it was a raid, a snatch and grab raid that was executed with absolute precision, overwhelmingly successful at the operational and the tactical level, but I don't know how much it's nested in a strategic policy. And we kind of run into the same things that we had. We just did a movie review on a Fallujah Najaf video that PBS did called The Last 600 Yards.
Meters, Vic.
600 meters. And there's a lot of echoes in operational tactical successes not being nested within an overall security strategy, and then everyone just looking around going, so what the hell did we just do? Is that a good tee up? Did I tee that up okay?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, right. And there's also 2,000 meters to Andreevka, which is worth watching as well. They're different. They have different contexts. Look, I mean, we'll talk about the operation, and we'll talk about, I think, the broader context. I do want to begin with an important caveat.
Yes, please do.
Yeah. I'm not an expert on Venezuela. And, my expertise on Latin America is about as good as anybody else who reads the newspaper. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. And what's going to be really interesting if we get deeper into Venezuela and maybe Mexico and other places, is you're going to start seeing people speaking more confidently about those places, about Venezuela in particular. And I would always just be cautious and thoughtful and look into their backgrounds and make sure that they know what they're talking about. And
sure. And I think that's a great starting point to this conversation, because I'm of the mindset that if someone says I know, they don't.
Yeah, right. Or Americans think is always another good one, right? Yeah.
Right. There's this very general, broad strokes things that try to attempt to validate your opinion, but at the end of the day, it's just opinion. And we've talked this piece with Dr. Mike Hunziker and with Colonel Woodbridge. Like, we're pulling this from open source, unclass information. So we're going to be jumping headfirst into the world of speculation, but as two former Marines and as someone who deals extensively in foreign policy, it's not just wild speculation.
No, and there's plenty to work on here. And I think starting with your point about this being a raid, that's a really important point. And there was some effort by parts of the administration to portray this as purely a law enforcement operation. You don't fly 150 combat aircraft and destroy an IADS and launch helicopter gunship fire into the capital.
There was a cyber attack at the Phase Zero too, right? That shut down the power. I mean, from what we understand.
You could do that as part of a law enforcement operation. Yeah, you can't do all these other things and call it a law enforcement operation. It was a military operation. It was a raid. And if we think about that kind of operation taking place in Washington, D.C., I don't think we'd call it anything but a war. Right? So it was war. And so we should treat it that way, at least analytically and objectively. The administration can call it whatever it wants. So if we think about it that way, then this is a battle. This was hopefully not the first battle of Caracas in 2026, but it was a battle. And so it gives us a lot to sink our teeth into. And raids are a specific type of operations. They're designed from the outset to have a built-in withdrawal. As you note, it was highly successful. But I think, as the department has been clear on, and we've gotten public information on, there were casualties. There was at least a pilot of an MH-47 that was hit 3 times. Apparently, they were still able to fly the aircraft. Apparently, a number of the troops were on the ground, got hit as well. Some of them critically, if I remember correctly. So it wasn't a flawless operation. I think we have to be careful there. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is, what if the angle of fire into the cockpit of that aircraft had been slightly different?
Sure.
And what if the co-pilot and the pilot had been hit simultaneously, the flight controls had been, destroyed or damaged, and that bird went down? We'd be having a very different conversation right now. And raids like that are very tenuous operations, flying helicopters in modern environment.
Especially at that scale. I mean, granted, as an AAV company commander, I had very limited strategic level assets at my disposal. But even when I would do a raid in mass, there was a lot of moving pieces, a lot of ways those things could have gone pear-shaped.
Yeah, and the timing has to be perfect. As well, right? And you have backups to backups to backups, and you have a lot of, clearly in this case there was a lot of rehearsal. Apparently they built a mock-up of the building they were going to enter, which is commonplace for this level of operation, which is good. And I'm glad that nobody on our side died.
Absolutely.
I'm glad that casualties apparently were limited, but we do need to think about it in those terms, and that there was an element of luck here as well, as there is in any war. And at some point, if we continue to do things like this, we have to think about the consequences of that luck running out. that's probably beyond useful speculation here. I think the more important discussion to have is probably about what comes next. Again, not an expert on Venezuela. However, looking at the geopolitical situation and trying to understand what it is we've actually done there in terms of setting up this new administration with Delcy Rodriguez, it doesn't look like much has changed. We may be able to extract oil money. However, there was a terrific article in the New York Times that at least presents a publicly available kind of layman's understanding of the complexity on the ground in Venezuela. So building off of that analysis written by an actual expert on Venezuela, you see this complex interrelated network of gangs all competing with one another over oil money and drug money, controlling different territories. You have Colombian paramilitaries, you have Cuban intelligence agents, Lebanese Hezbollah, Iran involved in other ways there, all sorts of just other narco and non-narco criminal gangs operating there. And then, of course, you have all sorts of localized neighborhood issues as well. And you can see in the map, which is really helpful there, you always have to be careful looking at zones of control because they're never realistic, but you can see how complex.
Sure, and then there's an aspect even, and I don't know how much of this is also speculation, but there's been talk of like even Chavez loyalists that even that predate even the Maduro regime.
Right. There's the gangs that are controlled by this is very commonplace, right? And that the regime, any dictatorial regime, tends to have its kind of thug army that it controls. We remember this. Anybody old enough to remember our operation in Panama remembers the Dignity battalions, and the Iranians have their own form of that. And you can go through just about any dictatorship has its own thugs. Yeah. Russia has its own motorcycle gang thugs.
Well, we remember during the invasion, we used to joke that it was the Cinnabon defense around Baghdad, right? Because you had your conscripts, and then as you got closer and closer, you got into the Republican Guard, the Special Republican Guard. And it got more loyal as you got closer to the palace, right?
So my question with this is, we're throwing around I hear a lot of the media, a lot of the terminology being used is regime change. Is that actually applicable to what has happened as a result of this raid? Was that the intent, or is it just specifically for Maduro, even though now his VP is in charge? And again, you mentioned a lot has not changed on the ground. Does this count as regime change? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's Maduro change. I don't think it's regime change as I would understand regime change. And the reason, so it's a great question, and I was kind of building up in that direction anyway, in that the locus of control remains the same. The people that control the violence and the guns and the money, I believe that's all relatively unchanged. There is some effort to knock out some of the top folks at the very head of those militia groups and intelligence organizations. In historical terms, taking out top people generally doesn't alter entire redundant organizations. And in fact, there's somebody always waiting there to fill their shoes. Sometimes they're worse than the person that they took out. Yep. Again, looking at it from a layman's perspective, if you look at Rodriguez's history, she is not a pro-American Democrat or even a pro-American transactional oil baron. I mean, this is an ideologue who, apparently is in the pocket of Cuban intelligence, has a very close relationship with the Russians, has a close relationship with the Chinese. By the way, we didn't mention the Chinese as well. So, Vic, when we had this conversation, quick answer is no, I don't see this as regime change. I see this as a puppet modification. And that has consequences for the Marine Corps down the road here. When we had this conversation previously, we were talking about the Marines going ashore in some form, right? Mm-hmm. And one of the most obvious options that we had discussed was a forcible entry operation to go in and seize Caracas, maybe Maracaibo, and some of the oil infrastructure along the northern coast. It seems like that option has been taken off the table for the moment. However, the forces are still ready to do that. We still have 2MEF in charge of that joint task force. Southern Command, which is traditionally not a command that controls operational forces, is about to have a new commander if all goes well. I'm not sure if he's been approved yet, but Frank Donovan, my former platoon commander, great guy, He may have some ideas as well about how this is going to be organized and run. We still have to think about this in terms of a perspective, not necessarily just a forcible entry operation, but what about a gentle introduction or let me rephrase that in more military terms, an administrative introduction of Marines or the joint force into Venezuela in order to take control of whether it's oil infrastructure or something related to that. And I think it's worth discussing the implications of that kind of operation.
And because the array of forces in the Caribbean hasn't been reduced. Like, there's still a carrier group there. Like you said, Southcom is still clearly focused on this region. I think what Puerto Rico is still being used as a hub for F-35s. Is that right? I mean, as far as we know.
As I understand it, yeah.
So, I mean, really, the only de-escalation that has happened has been on the news cycle shifting its focus elsewhere. But from a DOD standpoint, like you said, the only thing that changed was the guy that's on the HVI list.
Yeah, and clearly, at least based on public reporting, is that there had been long ongoing negotiations to fill the power vacuum when Maduro left, and that's somehow that negotiation is in play. Remains to be seen whether or not that holds. And I think that there's a range of kind of diplomatic strategic questions there that are going to feed the next decision that comes. It doesn't seem likely to me that the president is going to give up the idea of controlling Venezuela. So if things don't go in his favor there, then the force option remains on the table.
Yeah.
Look, I mean, and by the way, I mean, a little side note here, all these forces in the Caribbean on the West Coast offshore are not in the Asia-Pacific theater, right. Addressing what's supposed to be our pacing threat. Mm-hmm. And I believe we had another aircraft carrier also pulled off to go deal with Iran.
Wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, because that was on the table as well.
Right. And so geostrategically, if you place Venezuela within a much broader context and you look at the amount of force being drawn away, aviation, shipping, manpower, including our very scarce ground combat capabilities.
DLA LOGCOM is not working on supporting stand-in forces and expeditionary advanced basing right now.
Yeah, and that's a great point too. I mean, if you've ever worked inside the military as a civilian or as a military person, you know what happens whenever there's a military operation. It's like 5-year-old soccer or the Eye of Sauron or whatever you want to call it. All right, everybody just starts running towards the ball. And I think a great example here is that, I won't say which one, but there was an intelligence organization prior to the Arab Spring in 2011 that had maybe one analyst covering all of North Africa. And within a week, they had 150 or something analysts covering North Africa. And they were all people that had been pulled off the Mexico desk and the Venezuela desk, probably. Right. So there is an opportunity cost to all of these things, right? And then there's only so much attention historically that the entire organization, the department, the nation, the executive branch, as writ large, is able to put towards these problems, and it requires an extraordinary amount of energy and effort to keep this giant machine moving. So there's some risk in this kind of mercurial approach to strategy and geopolitical interest that may be hidden from us at the moment.
Yeah. And I guess I don't know if this is OBE, but one aspect of the sort of the threat landscape that we didn't talk about that may be implied, but is their version of Secretary of Defense was a Maduro hardliner. He's still there, and he's still very much in control of their armed forces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the guy in charge of the intelligence apparatus and all the other people at DIA and CIA and elsewhere are certainly tracking and have good insight into, they have not been removed.
Yeah. So I guess as we're talking then strategy, in the most objective way possible, how was this action nested within our NSS and NDS?
Okay, without endorsing anything within any of those documents, just speaking purely from an analytic perspective, the NSS does lean the United States towards what I think has been now referred to as the Monroe Doctrine, or the Donald Trump reinterpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, right? Which is that we control the Western Hemisphere, or this is our sphere of influence, and we'll do what we want here. Which I would argue is a misinterpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, but it doesn't really matter, right? The idea here is that this is ours. That's been stated more plainly for Venezuela in terms of that oil is ours, with the justification being that Venezuela nationalized some U.S. company oil assets in a previous iteration, and therefore we need to retain control of all of those capabilities. That's a strategy. It is one that is misaligned with all previous American strategy, possibly dating back to the early 1800s. But I guess that's what it is.
Yeah, but in one of our previous discussion with Colonel Woodbridge, the banana wars came up, and I think that's probably the last time that we were so sort of narrowly focused on Central and South America, and that was a lot of it had to do with fruit, thus the banana wars.
Right. Did he bring up Smedley Butler as well?
Yes,
of course
he did. Of course, right? Yeah. I mean, you can't bring up Smedley Butler. You can't bring up that banana wars without bringing up Smedley Butler and War is a Racket. And if you haven't read it and you're not really intimately familiar with Smedley Butler's history, it's worth going in and reading more about him. There's been one or two good biographies written about Smedley Butler. I think one of them actually said he had 3 Medals of Honor and turned one of them down, if I remember correctly from my now very dated doctoral work. But the point being is that even Butler, who was a Quaker, saw a lot of cynicism in that very transactional approach to supporting, the United Fruit Company? Sure. So you could bring into question all of the operations that took place in Nicaragua, in Haiti, throughout the early 20th century at the very least. And so then you start asking, well, what was Mike Edson, Red Mike Edson doing in the Cocoa River Patrol, in Nicaragua? What was going on? Why did Cusco Wells part of our history? Was it only because of a transactional relationship? And it's worth exploring that and thinking about that, thinking about the role of the Marine Corps as an arm of national strategy.
Yeah, in that way.
Yeah, it is. It is. I'm not sure we need to be having that existential discussion at the Lance Corporal Network, level.
No,
but
understood. I guess I'm just trying to paint, use all of the colors on our painting tablet as we try to understand the context of this operation. And then really what's next, I guess, was the next thing. Is like, so if we have a viable, if this action is nested within our overall national strategy, what's next?
Yeah, and this is difficult, right? We brought this up, I believe, the last time I was here, right? And it's very difficult because we now have a standing senator and others who are being administratively addressed over some public statements they made about disobeying orders. I'm certainly not recommending or suggesting anything here. However, any order that is given to the U.S. military has legal, ethical, and moral implications to it, and we all know our roles. The active duty folks should be trained and educated in what they are supposed to do and not supposed to do. So it is worthwhile to educate and to discuss these things ahead of time and to have an idea of what is and is not legal, ethical in the situational context, and broadly moral. Not saying there's anything immoral about the national security strategy or unethical with the national security strategy. I do think that it is worth discussing whether or not it is appropriate to use military force to take oil.
Yeah, and that's interesting that you mentioned that. What are some of your thoughts? I'm going to put my cynical hat on right now, but both of us in the Middle East, through non-competitive contracting, every DFAC, every pisser you went into was KBR. So where then does the sort of bluntness of this strategy?
Well, I think the terminology like Colonel Woodbridge brought is like almost like the return of realpolitik, where essentially, rather than trying to shroud it behind supposed moral and ethical reasons, we're just being blunt about what our strategy and purpose is.
Yeah, I understand that interpretation of it, and I think I'm not saying he's endorsing that. It sounds like he was talking about it, right? Yes. I mean, you could also just kind of call it cynicism. I mean, there are all sorts of debates over what realpolitik actually means and how it should be interpreted. Look, I mean, ethical, moral behavior, the idea that the world, we can play a role, the United States can play a role in the world that makes the world a better place, not only for others, but for ourselves in doing so, right? And that all boats rise by applying high ethical standards, high moral standards, right. At least through our interpretation.
Providing order.
Whether order or even and protection, right? Yeah. Protection to the weak, which we've tried to do in the past. Now, have we done a good job of that? No, we've done a terrible job of it in general. Have we been cynical about it in the past? Absolutely, we've been cynical about it. I mean, I can distinctly remember President Biden. I will never forget, in fact, an interview with President Biden between the election and the time he took office, where a reporter asked him if he would feel responsible for all of the women and children that would be abandoned to the Taliban if we withdrew, and without hesitation, he said absolutely not. And that was a stomach-flipping moment for me, right? I mean, you can be naive and then continually disappointed and believe that, look, the United States is a force for good always, so on and so forth. You can be cynical and just say, no, everything is ours. We take what we want by force, and if we can't take it by force, then we just give it to somebody else. I'd argue that is maybe that's the flip side of the coin to kind of positive naivete. Mm-hmm. There is another perspective to take here, and that we should at least have some goals for ourselves and for others, and try continually to achieve those, even when we fall short. I think it's the same kind of stuff we teach our kids.
Yeah, the journey's in the path sort mm-hmm. of thing. You can't necessarily focus so much, but you're going to develop, or you're going to gain character, or there's going to be something not tangible and intrinsic in at least the attempt, right?
Yeah, this got philosophical pretty quickly.
Yeah, it seems like we're venturing a little bit into American exceptionalism.
I mean, we are, right? But I mean, doesn't that tie right back to what's happening?
Yeah, about to say
in Venezuela.
Exactly. What color of it are we talking?
That's right. Yeah. And to the United Fruit, again, if I got it wrong, but the United Fruit Company. I mean, and some, depending on the interpretation of our strategy in Iraq in the Gulf War, right? I mean, there were people that thought we were fighting for oil there. I didn't see it that way as a historian. I don't see it that way still, but I understand the perception.
Right. There's echoes of it. Mm-hmm. For sure.
So one facet of strategy I wanted to address while we have you here is we Vic and I were speaking beforehand. Is like, and you talked about it a little bit. There's different pools in how other, especially our peer adversaries, are viewing this, particularly Russia and China. You've mentioned, we've shifted away from the Pacific, especially with the group we have in off Venezuela, and now we have another near Iran. But Vic and I also discussed this before we had our interview. The fact that Venezuela was armed with Russian and Chinese equipment, and that was pretty systematically.
They had A2AD. I mean, granted, probably not top of the line stuff, but pretty advanced, viable platforms, right?
Exactly. So, what is this? In what way is this signaling? Either deterrence towards Russia and China, or is it signaling we're going to look away from Russia and China and focus on other things we have going on and closer to our backyard? Or is it both?
No, it's a great question. And look, I'm a proponent of dealing with the China issue globally, and I think I've said publicly and written that we've been overly myopic in treating China as a pacing threat, because we're treating China as a pacing threat only around the 9, or I think they called it 10, whatever, the 9-dash line, right? So I've always thought that was a mistake, and the argument that I made in the 3-part series, War on the Rocks, was that the Marine Corps had opportunity to think about competing with China globally in what I called an out-of-area operation, right? So the Belt and Road is...
Yeah, about to say, Belt and
Road's global.
Just in the first island chain.
That's right. And it's unprotected. There are no Chinese troops guarding Chinese factories and Chinese mines all across North Africa, the Middle East, South Asia. There's tremendous opportunity there to put pressure on China out of that area. And I would argue... now I'm not just blindly in support of the operations in Venezuela or our strategy, but look, I mean, if you want to put pressure on China, certainly this was one good way of doing it. I would have perhaps done it differently. Does it put pressure on Russia? Yes, it does. There have been Russian, not necessarily troops, but mercenaries, intelligence officers in Venezuela for quite some time. They've been ramping up their presence and capabilities. They've been selling things and giving and donating things to the Venezuelan regime with the hopes that they would be able to retain control over their oil development and distribution to some extent, which directly affects the Russian budget, obviously. That treats them as a military consumer, which the Russians like for export purposes. And now we seem to have kind of stuck our thumb in their eye here, which is a weird cognitive dissonance between that and what we're doing, at least on the diplomatic level, with Ukraine.
Right.
But we did seize a ostensibly Russian-flagged vessel right under the nose of Russian warships. We did destroy the Russian IADs, which, according to public sources, was not even connected.
Yeah.
So it wasn't some great military feat. It had to be done. But the BUK, I'm not going to try to pronounce it, the BUK system, I believe is S-300s. Those are not throwaway systems. I mean, those are fairly formidable, and we destroyed them. It doesn't help Russia's arms sales overseas, given the performance of their material in Ukraine, and then also what just happened in Venezuela. So in this case, both China and Russia have been nudged back a little bit. And I think whatever else you may think about the operation, again, preferring perhaps to do it in a different way and in a different context, this is not necessarily a bad thing in terms of our global power competition.
Yeah. I definitely, that was one of the takeaways. Just looking at things, and just doing the pro-con thing, unaligned, is that again, at that operation at tactical level, I mean, it really was shocking at the swiftness and apparent ease at which it was executed. Like you said, tons of front-loaded planning, as rightful as should be, but us being so far removed from the Afghan withdrawal now. I mean, we're 6 years from the Afghan withdrawal, which was, a gut punch for all of us. And then to be, execute in Iran and execute here, it is sort of it's a flex, right? It's a flex. Regardless of what you would say about any of the other implications of this, it's from a military operational tactical level. I think it puts the world on notice that, hey, we still are very badass.
We are, and our capabilities clearly have not been terribly diminished.
Right.
However, circling back, right, so my job is to say however. I
Please.
guess, right, sure.
Yeah,
right,
that's why you're here, man.
That's why I don't get invited to a lot of...
If we want, William and I can sit here and smell our own farts all day. We need you in here.
I don't get invited to a lot of parties. So, but tying this back to the idea of this being a raid and being self-contained and controlled and having, all the space and time to think about and plan for every potential eventuality. I'm sure there was a plan for what happened if one of those helicopters or several helicopters went down. Nobody wanted to see Black Hawk down again, right? So I'm sure that was very carefully built into the plan. It'd be interesting to see what happens when we have to run a continuing operation where we don't get the benefit of standoff timing and rehearsal and the ability to withdraw. And that's where things get complicated, and that's where things get ugly. And so maybe that's a good segue to tying the Marines back into this, the potential for ground operations, either in Venezuela or elsewhere.
Yeah. And in that case then, because really other than just musical chairs, because there was so little change on the ground, even the opposition party is still not invited to the dance. All of the things we talked about in the last episode then are still very much on the table, and it's still very much a cautionary tale, right?
They seem to be. I mean, I don't see how anybody would take those options off the table. And when we say options, we mean, again, and the more extreme would be a forcible entry operation, amphibious assault by the joint force led by U.S. Marines, and in this case, 2MEF, putting Marines ashore to seize inland objectives, so a combination of ship-to-objective maneuver and across-the-beach operations and everything else. And then you start looking at, again, all the complexities ashore, the human complexities, the geographic complexities, the space, right, the challenge of time and space, the further you get inland. and then also the weather, the terrain, the trees, the urban terrain, all of those things start to add layers of complexity. They start adding variables that eventually catch up with you. And we all know, anybody that's been involved in a war or studied a war knows that those are inescapable. And casualties happen, things break, plans go awry, unseen threats emerge. And so, war is still war. It will be unchanged. And I would argue that the Marines could get stuck into a fight in Venezuela or even in Mexico or Greenland or somewhere else, where, not planning for it, even if it was not a forcible entry operation. So, for example, if there was an administrative introduction of Marine forces on the ground, let's say, for example, to protect installations. The State Department has recently warned all U.S. citizens to leave Venezuela. However, if we're going to have some physical presence on the ground there, we're going to be investigating how to rebuild their oil infrastructure. There are going to be U.S. citizens on the ground. Let's say some of those get kidnapped or killed. Now we put in security teams. The security teams are inadequate. You could imagine how this could go. I don't want to present a slippery slope argument. I'm just saying it's worth thinking about. And the next thing you know, maybe we don't have Da Nang 1965, but we do have Marines going ashore in an administrative capacity to guard a facility. Well, we know what happened. It is worth maybe looking back at Da Nang then, where we had a limited objective to protect an airbase. Protecting the airbase required putting Marines on the perimeter and getting them in the AO, then getting all the supplies ashore, getting the command and control ashore. And then what they quickly discovered is if you don't patrol out from the airbase perimeter, you're then within range of indirect fire. So now you got to patrol out. And patrolling out means engaging with the population. And engaging with the population means exposing yourself, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. You see how these things happen. Another good case to go back and look at, if you're not familiar with it, is I believe is the 1965 Venezuela interdiction. Dominican Republic interdiction. There's a great Marine Corps History Division monograph written on that whole operation and the degree to which it was kind of thrown together at the last minute. It was a joint Army and Marine Corps before the Joint Force existed, right? A whole joint Army and Marine Corps amphibious assault operation. And you can kind of get a sense for the chaos of what that looks like on the ground through that monograph.
Fascinating.
So I want to tie this into force design. Again, one thing we know with Colonel Woodbridge is that the Marines were either not involved or very, very peripherally involved. What can we extract then how do we adjust force design to make it more fit something like this? Or does it need an adjustment at all?
No, I don't think it needs an adjustment. I think again, I'm without advocating for or opposing force design as a concept, I have been public about my criticism about the degradation in overall combat power. However, the concept itself, the stand-in force, putting Marines deep into the kind of what kind of littoral we're going to call it now. There's all the terms are shifting, right? But getting inside the Chinese kind of operational loop, that's already done, right? And the Marine littoral regiments already exist. There's about, 4,000 Marines involved with that whole operation.
Yeah, I don't know the numbers, but yeah,
about that.
Third MLR is a thing.
It's a thing.
Right? They have a guide on and everything. Yeah.
There's absolutely, I see no connection between 3rd MLR's mission statement, operations and capabilities, and what happened in Venezuela or what might happen in Iran or Nigeria. There's no reason to try to draw a connection between that operational concept and every single thing that happens around the world. And that opens up, maybe that opens up force design to too much critique, or maybe it seems too critical. But the whole idea is that, remember that original argument against force design, which was you're trying to reshape the Marine Corps, the entire Marine Corps, at least was perceived that way. Depending on whether or not General Berger and his staff intended it that way, that's a whole separate argument. But the perception was, hey, you're trying to recraft the whole Marine Corps to do this one narrow thing in this one narrow theater. Again, whether or not that's a fair critique, it's now played out, right? So it's played out maybe in a way that's perfectly fine. We've done that. We've got enough Marines doing those things. That's great. Now, let's talk about what a MEB needs to be able to do in a forcible amphibious assault into northern Venezuela. That's not the stand-in force.
Right.
Period.
Yeah.
We're not the JTAC of the Joint Force.
Yeah.
That means putting Marine infantry with joint fires ashore and moving through urban terrain and clearing it and holding it. Nothing substantive has changed about that kind of operation since 2004 or 1968,
right.
or you can go back and look at. As we're having this conversation, I really recommend people to go back and look at the History Division monographs from the 20th century. Some of them are just fantastic, and the detail that they present are amazing. Go back and look at the Incheon Seoul operation, right? I mean, the complexities, the necessity for manpower, the violence, none of those things have substantively changed, and it doesn't matter if you want to put small teams in. The things that will happen to the small teams everywhere else in every other war will happen to them here.
Yeah. What does the what does the raid then signal to us, again, from a strategy perspective, and to other world leaders or other peer competitors who maybe are buying in on the spheres of influence thing? Is this, again, did we just put the globe on notice, or is this something that there's after actions that people are pulling nuggets from, and then I don't know. I'm sort of rambling here.
No, you're not.
Okay.
That's a great question. I mean, we can only hope their adversaries are as myopic as we are, right? And that they look at one thing and we can only focus on one thing at a time. That they can only focus on one thing at a time, and they go, "Holy crap! Look what the U.S. military can do. We better back off." And that's military force applied successfully is always a great deterrent. A wiser adversary would look and go, "Wow, the CH-47 class of helicopter, which the MH-47 is a derivative of, was created in the mid-1960s. And in fact, if I'm correct, none of the airframes that were used except for the F-35 were created in the 21st century. And my guess is that some version of the rifles that were used by the special operators were created in the 20th century, and a lot of the missiles have derivations to things. So we actually were applying some pretty old technology against some pretty old Russian technology, and then when it came down to it, it was people fighting people. So there was no magic there. And I wouldn't be terribly impressed by American technology in this case. We did things that we've done in many previous wars. I'm not advertising that to the Russians or the Chinese as come get us. I just try to see things for what they are rather than what they're advertised as.
Yeah. And then do you think that, say, I mean, I guess just to be specific, is this a signal to Xi that, hey, something like this in Taiwan is now on the table? And not to say, probably has always been. I'm not going to paint the Chinese.
Yeah, as I mentioned last time, the country doing, fishing boat piracy throughout the world isn't having moral scruples about doing a snatch and grab.
Not even the moral scruples, but the fact that they wouldn't have thought that they could do a military raid to snatch a key leader.
Yeah, but why would they?
Okay.
I mean, and again, another caveat, not an expert on Taiwan, not an expert on China. However, what's the point of that, right? I mean, if as we collectively understand it, if their strategic objective is to take absolute control of Taiwan, which they've been very clear about, which, by the way, would give them control of the Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing, right? I mean, all of the assets there that are critical to global manufacturing. Why would they bother with something like that? I mean, if they're going to take it, they're going to take it. Okay. And now, I think the broader strategic question is, does it look like the spheres of influence argument in the national security strategy as applied in Venezuela and potentially to be applied in Greenland, does that then give the Chinese carte blanche to go in and take Taiwan? It certainly signals to them that that's a possibility, and there were some very worrisome comments by our president after the fact. He was asked that question bluntly, and he kind of roundabout said, sure, and then kind of backtracked a little bit. I think the quote was something along the lines of, well, that would be up to President Xi. Mm-hmm. That hasn't been our policy, right? Our policy has been, no, you should not do that, while trying to avoid the idea of coming immediately to Taiwan's defense, leaving a bit of strategic ambiguity for deterrence purposes. That's being stripped away. So I believe it looks more and more likely. Do the Chinese need to use force in order to do that? I'm not clear that they do.
Right. Well, what about then in Eastern Europe? Eastern Europe. I mean, does this then take any kind of negotiation off the table for the Russians? Like, why? It's a sphere of influence. Why would I need to negotiate?
Well, the Russians have been abundantly clear. By the Russians, let's be clear. We're talking about Vladimir Putin here, right?
Right.
I mean, he's been absolutist from the start. He firmly 100% believes that Ukraine should be part of Russia. He does not believe the Ukrainian culture should exist. If it were up to him, he'd be perfectly happy to kill every single Ukrainian man, woman, and child, and all the animals in the entire country just to get that territory. He is not going to give an inch unless he's put into an extraordinarily desperate situation. So the 28-point plan that was originally, I believe, 28-point plan that was originally introduced to Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, those were his demands, and they clearly tee up the next phase of his operation, which is to pause, reset, rebuild the rest of his military, rebuild his ground forces, and then go take the rest of Ukraine. He hasn't backed off a centimeter from those things. I mean, there hasn't been any movement. This is not, I think it's really important for people to understand.
Yeah.
This is not a negotiation. A negotiation, in very traditional diplomatic terms, a negotiation takes place when the late Williams Artman put it best, right, is that both sides have reached some kind of mutual exhaustion, that they're both tired, they both want to solve this problem, and they're both willing to engage with each other. There's valid interlocutors, and that they are both willing to concede something. In this case, the sides are not willing to engage with each other. Well, Zelensky said he'd talk with Putin. Putin hasn't publicly engaged on this at all, right? The two sides have not had, I believe, unless I'm mistaken, have not had substantive direct engagement. There have been some talks here and there, but nothing substantive.
Fourth party, yeah.
And very clearly, the Ukrainians are playing for time, and they're doing so quite well, I would add, and necessarily so. And the Russians are unwilling to give an inch. This is not a negotiation. This is a forced submission, it's an effort to force a submission by a third party. And that's a very different thing.
Yeah. So then, I mean, really then, would it be fair to say that the sort of second and third order effects, or I guess the third and fourth order effects of Operation Absolute Resolve maybe are overblown by what we're getting on the unclassed side?
Yeah, I think so.
Those ripple effects really won't permeate on the global scale.
Right. I think careful and thoughtful analysts are going to look at this in its local context the same way that they would look at Operation Spider's Web.
Okay.
If you remember Spider's Web, right? So for those listeners that don't remember or aren't familiar, the Ukrainians spent, I think, something like a year planning this brilliant operation where drones were remotely launched out of trucks and other vehicles and flew in to attack Russian airfields deep inside of Russia. Brilliant operation, had very public, tremendous success. They were able to post a lot of the video online. And the reaction to Spider's Web, the immediate reaction was, oh my God, war has completely changed. Right. Everything is now going to be Spider's Web. Nothing is safe anywhere, and so on and so forth. Taking it completely out of context and forgetting that this was a very carefully planned intelligence operation, not a military operation, that had taken a very, very long time to prepare. And acting as if somehow people were going to do that every single day, everywhere across the world, right? I think the same thing applies here to the operation in Venezuela.
Man, it's a lot to chew on.
Well, Ben, we've chewed on it a lot. Thanks for coming in. Victor, have any final questions?
Not really.
I think I wore you out, Victor.
Yeah, I'm like, I'm going to take a nap. But yeah, no, I really do appreciate it, and thank you for following up. It's so interesting that we had something. It really, again, I can't emphasize enough, at least from my, really the nosebleed seats that I'm looking at this thing, just really how overwhelming and how shocking it was that this action occurred. And then for it to just not seemingly have, like we talked, the ripple effects have been quite minimal. It's if you threw a boulder into the water and then all you got was just a little bloop. And so it's a lot for me to try to digest because it seems like it should have much more impact globally than it seems to be having.
the world is moving too fast for all of us, I think, right now. Right? Certainly for the Eye of Sauron of the U.S. government, we need to become like the panopticon and grow eyes on the back of our heads and everywhere else.
Well, Ben, thank you again so much for making the trip down and for helping us with the, sort of figure out what's happening right now.
I don't know. I feel like I have more questions than answers.
Yeah, well, we'll have you back.
I'm always happy to be in Quantico and to have lunch at S&G.
All right, thanks, man.
Free advertisement.
Yeah, there you go.
Looking for insight, inspiration, and community? Tune in to Behind the Camouflage, the podcast made for Marine Corps spouses by Marine Corps spouses. We cover everything from navigating military life to finding joy in the journey. Subscribe now wherever you get your podcasts and stay connected with those who understand.
Scuttlebutt is a production of the Marine Corps Association. You have heard the voices or contributions from Major Vic Rubel, USMC retired, Nancy Litchman, William Truding, and our guest. Ty Frazier is the editor, sound engineer, and technical producer. The Marine Corps Association is not an agency of the U.S. government. The opinions expressed in this episode are the personal views of the participants and do not reflect the official position of the United States Marine Corps, the Department of Defense, or the Marine Corps Association.